Good evening, everybody. Alan Stout here from the Music on the Menu radio show, doing another one of our podcasts from home. I do these once in a while, not from the 105 The River Studio at Mohegan, Pennsylvania Casino, but rather from my home. I often do them from my bar, which is in the basement of my home, and it's sort of like I've said before, my little hard rock cafe. And so when I do them, I'm surrounded by, basically framed posters and images of some of my favorite artists of all time, as well as some memorabilia from my time in music journalism. And so tonight, I'm coming to you to talk to you about another documentary. I spoke with you a couple of times recently about rock documentaries. We did one on Elvis Presley Epic. We did one on the Bruce Springsteen documentary, Deliver Me from Nowhere. And I do love rock documentaries. I love watching them. And so and I know even during the pandemic, when I first started doing these podcasts, I talked about a whole bunch of them. And you could still find those out there on YouTube. Maybe I'll get these podcasts more organized someday up on a platform for podcasts. But for now, I just like doing them and putting them on social media and on YouTube on the Music on the Menu channel. I probably would have seen this McCartney movie a few weeks ago. It was in the theaters for a very limited time, but it was in the theaters at the exact same time as Elvis Presley Epic in Concert. And I have a busy life, and I can't get out to that many movies. And so I went to see Elvis, knowing that McCartney would be streaming pretty soon, and it is. So you can watch it right now on Amazon Video. And so that's where I watched it on Sunday. The reason that I was so excited about the McCartney documentary is that I have been saying for years to my circle of friends, and maybe I've talked about it on the radio, or maybe I've written about it at some point. I know I talked about it a lot last year when I was working on our Rockin' the River music series. I love Paul McCartney's post-Beatles work. I absolutely love it. Huge fan of the work he did in the 70s with Wings. Huge fan of things he did later, albums like Off the Ground and Flowers in the Dirt and Egypt Nation, which he just released in 2018 and actually went to #1 on the charts. He had a #1 album, in his 70s, I guess he would have been at the time. And so I just think he is such a treasure. And so when I saw that they were going to do a film based on that time of his career, from the time he left the Beatles right up until pretty much the end of Wings, so pretty much the 70s, I couldn't wait to watch it. And I'll tell you a little bit about how the movie starts. It starts off with chronology in a way, the ending of the Beatles, and John actually saying he was going to leave, and then Paul kind of falling into line. Paul goes out and records an album right away. And so, kind of who was the first one to leave, because John and Paul, Paul's got a solo album done, but John kind of told the band he was going to leave first. And so internally they knew that the band was over. And so they get into all of that, and McCartney tries to straighten it out, and from his perspective. And so obviously that's a great way to start the movie. And then they do talk about that first album that he did, McCartney, which he did very simple. It was very simple recording, almost demo 4-track stuff. But it did have a true gem on it, a classic, Maybe I'm Amazed, which is still a staple on some radio stations today. I know we play it all the time on 105 The River. Play the live version a lot, actually, on The River. And it's still a part of Paul's set list when he goes out on tour. what I really liked about Maybe I'm Amazed, in addition to the story, because it's not necessarily this let's do a deep dive on this album, and then let's do a deep dive on Ram, and then let's do a deep dive on Band on the Run, and it talks about all that, and it goes in chronology, but in between it all, you're also just sort of getting to see McCartney, the man, and his family, and his wife Linda, who he absolutely adored. You know, what a great rock and roll marriage they had for 30 years or so, until Linda passed from cancer back in, I believe it was 98. Um, I liked the honesty of some of the perspective in the movie. Not being, being such a little kid in the 70s when all this was happening, and maybe not discovering all the great Wing stuff until I was a little bit older. I didn't have the perspective that initially out of the gate, despite the fact that Paul had a solo record out first, and despite the fact that Maybe I'm Amazed is such a great song, there may have been a little bit of a perception that for the first few years of the 70s, John Lennon and George Harrison, who I also love very much as artists, may have had a little bit of the upper hand. In, if there was any sort of silent competition, John had released Imagine, and George had released All Things Must Pass, and those records came out before Paul McCartney released Band on the Run, 73, which really, I think, was Wings and Paul solo hitting his stride. And so that was interesting to me. Yeah, I guess I never really realized that Imagine and All Things Must Pass came prior to Band on the Run, which to me is the epitome of Paul McCartney's brilliance as a songwriter. Band on the Run is essentially 3 songs. If you really listen to it, there are 3 very distinct parts of the song. Stuck inside these 4 walls. We know how it starts, and then the will I ever get out of here? That's a part, and then of course when the rain exploded with a mighty. And so he has these 3 great melodies and parts of a track, and he puts them into one. And, it becomes a huge hit. And it's a timeless song. It's one of those songs that I've never tired of. Never. Anytime I hear it on the radio, I listen to it and I enjoy it just as much as the first time I ever heard it. And so that was an interesting part of the documentary. McCartney's home life was fascinating to me. I knew he lived on a farm, like in Scotland, but I guess I kind of imagined it was a Paul McCartney farm in Scotland, that it was pretty fancy farm. Not at all. I mean, wow, these guys were earthy. It was totally his escape to be out on that farm with his family and sheep, and some of the videos, considering everybody considered him the cute Beatle, and they were known for being very fashionable. The way they dressed in the 60s, even in the mop top days, the guys were sharp. They knew how to dress, and he was very much a rugged hippie there for a while, living out on that farm. But that's what brought him joy, and you could see that in the home videos. And so I really enjoyed that part of the documentary as well. I think that really is, one of the best parts of it is so much footage from the Beatles, and the anthology documentary that was made in '95, which I think was 6 hours long, and then the Let It Be film that came out a few years ago, which was more than 6 hours long. I have a great Beatles documentary that was made in, I think, 1982. I think it's just called The Beatles. 2 hours or so of just great footage. They filmed everything, the Beatles. They loved video cameras back in the 60s. So there's so much there. And I never get tired of watching it. But to see the footage of Wings in the studio working on a record, or to see some of the videos for some of the songs that were made at that time. Maybe it would be something like My Love, or a track that, Jet. And so that was great. That's great that all that video that has probably been out there in one way or another all over the place over the years has sort of been put together in a definitive 2 hour Paul McCartney documentary. The changing of band members in Wings was interesting. Each guy who, whether they were in the band for a short amount of time or a long amount of time, like Denny Laine, is given some time. Paul really wanted to be in another band. He liked the band structure. And it took him a while, I think, to realize I can't just be in a band. When the Beatles started, they were so young. They were all four lads from Liverpool who started something together. And Ringo may have come on a little bit later, but still he was there pretty much right from the beginning, from the success and Beatlemania. And they all lived that together. And that experience was something that they shared. It was an experience like no other band has ever experienced, probably, in the history of rock and roll. There have been other bands that have had mega success and blew up overnight. You could, just off the top of my head, how big was Bon Jovi in 1987 with MTV and Living on a Prayer, and all the videos that they put out from the New Jersey album. They had a run there from about 3 years where they were the biggest band in the world. But I don't think there's anything, talk about a band who, I love. I talk about Kiss in 77, 78, winning the Gallup poll, breaking Beatles attendance records at Budokan in Japan. But there was anything like Beatlemania, for a band. What the Beatles went through in 64 and what they experienced was experienced by Elvis Presley in 56. But Elvis went through that alone. The Beatles guys went through that together as a band, as songwriters. And by the time that, Paul puts Wings together, he's already the most famous, one of the top 3 or 4, 5 famous musicians on the planet. He's there with the other Beatles and Elvis and Sinatra and those guys. It's just, the top of the world. And so how are we just going to have a band and have the other guys feel that this is a democracy and that we're all in this together? And they tried. I mean, really did. They started off playing small venues and kind of grinding it out on a tour bus. And it really wasn't, you would think that, the Rolling Stones were playing stadiums by, I think, 72, 73. Paul McCartney could have done that right out of the gate, I would think. But he didn't do that until I guess it was 76 with Wings Over America, which is a famous album. I think it's a triple album. And that is really when he had quite an impressive catalog of solo material, post Beatles material, Wings material. And he had a really good band with Wings. And they had been doing enough shows over the years that they were really ready to take it up to the top and basically do the same type of tour that bands like Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones have been doing for quite a while. And it's awesome. I mean, wow. The stuff from Madison Square Garden is so cool. I did not know that there were very strong rumors that there was a possibility that the Beatles might show up at McCartney's shows at Madison Square Garden on that tour. There's literally live news coverage from the concert where there's like reporters like reporting back to the news agencies. Like, I guess he did multiple nights, and after the first night, they literally reported on the news, well, no Beatles showed up tonight, but maybe tomorrow. I mean, they were really expecting this to happen, and it didn't. I think Ringo was there as a friend, as a fan, and I don't even think the other guys were at the shows. I know they weren't. We would have heard about it at some point over the years if John Lennon was even there watching in the wings. John Lennon and Paul McCartney definitely were together around that same time, watching Saturday Night Live when Lorne Michaels, I think, offered them $3,000 to come down, and they did talk about it. And Paul talks about that in the documentary. Paul was in New York hanging out at the Dakota with John. They were watching Saturday Night Live. The show was relatively new. It was only on for about a year. And Paul actually wasn't even that familiar with it, I guess. And John said, oh, this show's really becoming popular here in America. It's funny. Let's watch it. And so they're watching it. And, of course, Lorne Michaels goes on. And I don't think Lorne Michaels has actually been on the screen on Saturday Night Live very often at all. And that was probably the most famous time where he basically offered the Beatles to come down to the studio and play. And John and Paul, they almost did it. But then they realized, what are we going, how will it serve us? It's great for the show. But, John at that point was really happy being a home dad, and Paul was riding high with Wings. And so they decided not to do it. But he does talk about it. They did almost hop in the car and do it just for fun. And who knows what could have happened if they did. The reaction, maybe something would have sparked. There's actually no evidence at all, because I've watched other podcasts and listened to other folks that were interviewed that were in the inner circle with John Lennon, and people that were hanging out at the Dakota in the late 70s when Paul and Linda McCartney would swing by. And I guess it happened right up until Christmas of 78, I think may have been the last time. And they were old friends getting together for the holiday just like anybody else. They never, from anything I've ever read, sat and strapped on their guitars together and played music together, except for that one time in LA, I think in the early 70s during John Lennon's quote-unquote lost weekend, where there was a whole bunch of people in the studio, and they wound up making a recording that was kind of just all over the place and kind of chaotic. Nothing of substance ever came of it. But for Beatle collectors, it's interesting because it's the last time they recorded together. But as far as the two of them, one-on-one, hanging out at the Dakota, 6, 7, 8 years after the Beatles broke up, just as friends, even strumming on some guitars, never happened. And so the Saturday Night Live thing, I guess, would have been really, really something. And of course, the documentary goes pretty much right up until the time of Coming Up, McCartney 2 album, which, I remember I still have the 45 of that song when it came out. I guess I was in about 7th or 8th grade. And a lot of fans know that it's a 2-sided single. And the flip side is the live version, which is, I think, so much better. The live version is just amazing. And if you want to try to connect something with John and Paul one last time, and I'd heard this before, and Paul does talk about it a little bit in the documentary, briefly. John Lennon liked that song. He thought the Coming Up was really good. And it got the maybe brotherhood competitive nature it scratched that itch a little bit. And so because of the success of Coming Up in the spring of 80, it was part of the reason, at least, that John decided to write and realized that maybe it was time for his 5-year hiatus where he was, at home, a stay-at-home dad. Maybe it was time to start working on some music. And, of course, that led to Double Fantasy, which was his last album, which included Woman and Watching the Wheels and Starting Over. And, it was riding the charts, literally, at the time that he was killed. So there is a connection there a little bit with McCartney, too, though, because McCartney had put out Coming Up, and John liked it and said, my old mate here, he's been doing a lot of good music over the last couple of years. And some of the stuff John liked from Wings and some of it he didn't. And if you know anything about Lennon, he was very honest about things. And so that's all there. That's all in the documentary. I love the stuff from 1976. I guess, my first memories of McCartney, well, a couple of things are kind of interesting, because I do get a little more personal on these podcasts. The Beatles song, Got to Get You Into My Life, which is, on a Beatles record. I think it's from Rubber Soul or Revolver. It goes back to the mid-'60s. It was re-released in around 76 for a Beatles Best Of album as a single, and it charted. So it's on the radio in the top 40. And considering it was 11 years old at the time, and it was really from pretty early in the Beatles' career, it sounded so fresh and contemporary. I thought it was Wings for a long time. When I was probably in like 5th grade, I thought that Got to Get You Into My Life was Wings. And, eventually you start to put all the pieces together. And you realize, that was the Beatles, and this is McCartney, and this is Wings. I've always just loved the song Silly Love Songs. It's the summer of 1976. I was a little kid living in South Wilkes-Barre, and that was the year my mother remarried, and we moved over to Kingston at the end of the summer. So that was the last summer that I really spent in the part of northeastern Pennsylvania that are my roots. Lee Park, where my grandparents lived, in Hanover Township, but the Lee Park section of Hanover Township, which borders with South Wilkes-Barre on Division Street. That's literally the end of where the two towns meet. And my mom and I lived over closer to Myers High School on Carlisle. And we would go riding bikes sometimes. And whenever I hear Silly Love Songs, it just reminds me of riding through Minor Park in South Wilkes-Barre with my mom, being, 8 years old. And that song was the #1 song of the year. It was the #1 song on the charts. And it always takes me back to that time, which was really a great time. It was a lot of neat things happening. Playing Little League down at St. Teresa's that summer, and McCartney on the radio all the time, this former Beatle who was just really at the top of the world with Wings Over America. I look at the Paul McCartney album that came out in, I guess it was the late 80s, called All the Best. And I'm holding the CD here right now. And this is absolutely one of my favorite records in my collection of CDs. Band on the Run, Jet, Ebony and Ivory, Listen to What the Man Said, No More Lonely Nights, Silly Love Songs, Let 'Em In, Say, 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 that's the one he did with Michael Jackson, Live and Let Die, Another Day, Junior's Farm, Uncle Albert, Coming Up, Good Night Tonight. I love that song. I love Good Night Tonight. With a Little Luck, love that song. My Love, I'm Not Married, I was at one time. I'm divorced. But when I got married on the beach. And we had the reception a month or so later at the Woodlands. And I guess you could call it the ideal wedding, because the wedding, if you wanted to watch the wedding, it took however long the song My Love is. Because what we did is we had some pictures that we took at the shore of the marriage, and they were set to Paul McCartney's My Love. And they played it on a video screen before we walked in, so everybody got to see the wedding in 5 minutes, and then we came in and the party began. So, maybe that's it. Maybe for some people that's the best way to have a wedding. Wedding 5 minutes, party 4 hours. But that was actually my wedding song, My Love. And so I just love this record, particularly silly love songs, and With a Little Luck and Coming Up, and obviously Live and Let Die. I've seen McCartney in concert 3 times. I'll talk about that in a minute, but I just want to talk a couple little fun stories about McCartney. I don't get political on my radio show or on my social media at all. It's just not something I want to do. I go into the voting booth and I vote just like everybody else does, and that's where my power is. And so I think most people feel strongly about how they feel about things. And in my circle of friends, I'll talk about how I feel about things, and with my family around the dinner table sometimes, but that's about it. But I will say that my daughter is a freshman down at Philadelphia at LaSalle University, and she went to a protest recently, and she told me she was going. And she said she made a sign to take that said, "You say goodbye, I say hello." And she said that was the sign that she made. And she took it from her favorite Beatles song. And I got to tell you, you want to talk about a proud dad. I mean, first of all, I love the fact that she's paying attention to what's going on in the world and that she has opinions about things. And I love the fact that she tried to make a sign that was clever. When it came to the point she was trying to make. And I love the fact that it was a Paul McCartney song. And so, it's our family. Like I said, I do these podcasts from my bar. If you walk down the stairs to the bar, one of the first things you see is a framed poster of Abbey Road. And right behind the bar, front and center, the biggest, the central poster in the entire bar is a framed poster of the Beatles from the White Album era. And so just been a big part of my life, as so many people, Paul McCartney and his music, discovering the Red and the Blue albums when I was in high school, really diving into those records. Last year for Rockin' the River, which we do with my job at the Luzerne County Visitors Bureau, and I oversee those concerts. And, one of my jobs is to book the talent. We had a band called Maybe I'm Amazed, a tribute to Paul McCartney. And the reason that I booked that band and brought them is because I knew that some of those songs, like Band on the Run, were going to work beautifully at that venue. I just imagined 3,000 people sitting on the side of the Susquehanna on a beautiful Friday night in the summer with the sun starting to go down behind the Market Street Bridge. And I try to imagine sometimes what music is going to capture that moment. And I thought that some of Paul McCartney's solo stuff would be perfect. And I remember when I booked the band, I talked to their publicist and or their booking agent, and I said, I know that like a Paul McCartney show, he's going to play some Beatles stuff too, because Paul now plays lots of it. He didn't in the 70s with Wings, but starting in 1989-90, when he started touring for Flowers in the Dirt, he started putting a lot of Beatles in. But I told the band, I go, don't be afraid to play a lot of Wings stuff. That's why we booked you. We can get a Beatles band to do 90 minutes, 2 hours of Beatles if we want to. we're booking a Paul McCartney band called Maybe I'm Amazed because I want you to play those songs. I want to hear Silly Love Songs. I want to hear Band on the Run. I want to hear Live and Let Die. And I want to hear Maybe I'm Amazed. And so, because I knew the people would enjoy it. And those are songs that you don't hear in the bar all the time. Very rarely you walk into a bar, even in the days when the nightclubs were, banging with bands and hundreds of people going out to see live music all over town. You didn't hear somebody playing Band on the Run or With a Little Luck or My Love or Silly Love Songs. And so I Live and Let Die, which, obviously became popular with Guns N' Roses covered it too. But I knew that a McCartney solo act would fit what we do at Rock in the River. And it was our biggest night last summer. It had the biggest crowd. I knew it would be. And there was a moment when the band was playing Hey Jude. And you had, close to 4,000 people singing along to, the most famous part of Hey Jude at the end. And you have 4,000 people doing that on the side of the Susquehanna on a beautiful summer night. One of the coolest things I've ever seen. I actually got some video of that we posted on the Visit Luzerne County page. So my love for this guy as an artist, I've never talked about it this much before. So I knew this podcast that I was going to do tonight was going to be a little bit about the movie and just a little bit about how much I love Paul McCartney. I love John Lennon and I love Ringo and I love George Harrison. I really, really do. But McCartney has, especially since, John has been gone now for so long, he carries the legacy of the Beatles more than the others, and he's done it so beautifully. I wrote that I covered 3 of his concerts. No, I only covered 2 of them. The first time I saw them in 1993 when he was on tour that was for Off the Ground, right? Yeah. He was out on tour. I saw him at Giants Stadium at the Meadowlands. And that was the first time I saw him. The second time I saw him was in 2002 at the Wells Fargo Center in Philadelphia. I think it was called First Union back then, but same place. And then the last time I saw him was in 2016 at Hershey Park Stadium. And so, first time I see him, New York, New Jersey, 70,000. Last time I saw him, Hershey, 30,000 people. My favorite one was the one in the middle, and that was Philadelphia. Because that's a small show of only 18,000 people. But I remember writing in my review that, he carries that legacy of the Beatles, and the set list that he puts together is very long. Matter of fact, I'll post my review of that show in the comments where I post this podcast. So if you're listening to this podcast, just go into the comments and I'll post my review of the show in Philly from 2002. Wow. I mean, I probably have been to 500 concerts in my life. And probably 450 of them I was probably working, where I was covering it for a newspaper. And so I get asked a lot, what was the best show you ever saw? And when you're asked a question like that, and you think about, I saw the Stones, I saw U2, I saw Bruce Springsteen 10 or 11 times, saw Stones 4 times, saw U2 4 or 5 times. I'm a big Kiss fan. Obviously, they're an incredible live band. I saw them 36 times, maybe more. Lost count. The answer that always comes out immediately is McCartney 2002, because it's Paul McCartney. It's the biggest living rock star in the world, from the biggest band of all time, from the greatest band of all time, and he's playing all these songs that he wrote with the Beatles. that he sang with the Beatles, and plus he's throwing in all the great Wings stuff, and it's absolutely an incredibly, insanely incredible set list, and it's exhilarating, and you see people in the crowd getting misty-eyed. You see people getting emotional, like they know. You're very cognizant in the moment that you are seeing someone that is our Bach, our Beethoven, our Mozart. This is him. This is the guy. I'm in the same room with him, and he's singing songs that will be around long after we're all gone. And that it continues to connect with generation to generation. I was 3 years old when the Beatles broke up. I don't remember Beatlemania, but I discovered them at some point when I was a teenager, and I have loved them ever since. And that happened to the generation after me. They put out the Beatles #1 album. I think it was around 2002, and it was huge. And all of a sudden, another generation. And then they put out Anthology in the 90s, and they're on television for 3 nights. And then another generation. And then I got my 19-year-old daughter texting me the other day, "Hey, here's my sign I'm taking." And, it's a quote from Hello, Goodbye from the Beatles. And she said, "I've been listening to them a lot lately." And so it's very, very special to see him. And if you haven't done so, and he is going to tour a little bit this year. He's in his 80s now, and it's one of those things where I say run the credit card, man. I say empty the checking account, the savings account a little bit. Do it, just do it. We're all only here for this certain amount of time, and we're in a moment of time where we are contemporaries of someone like him. And if you get a chance to see him, I highly recommend you do it. I highly recommend you watch Man on the Run. If you are a fan of Paul McCartney post-Beatles music, which obviously a lot of people are. Wings were a huge band. They won Grammys. They had #1 albums. They were playing football stadiums. I mean, he took it about as big as you could get. And that only took him a couple of years after the Beatles broke up for him to get a body of work that he could go out and do that in a band that he loved, and left us with some great music. And that's what the documentary is all about. And I highly recommend you watch it. Believe it or not, at the very beginning of the film, he talks about how he was depressed after the Beatles broke up, and he was, on the farm in Scotland, and he was starting to tip the bottle a little bit too much, he admitted, and feeling very down. And he actually said, this blew my mind, when the Beatles broke up, Paul McCartney said, "I will never write another note of music again." That's what he thought. I will never write another note of music again. Well, he was wrong. He just announced the other day that he's got another new record coming out. So, he's going to be doing it until probably the day he dies. He talks about how I saw another documentary once or an interview once. It was at one of those meetings at the Dakota where I think it was Christmas of '78 where they're hanging out. And there was another guy there who overheard the conversation. And he said, Paul said, "Are you writing any music?" And John said, "No, I haven't picked up the guitar in a long time." And what about you? And he goes, I write every single day. I write music every day. And so he couldn't have been more wrong, when he said that about himself. I'll never write another note of music again, which he said in 1970 to himself. I'm happy he was wrong. I'm sure he's happy he was wrong. I'm sure, those of you out there that have this CD that I'm holding in my hands, Paul McCartney, All the Best, which is all of his great stuff from his time with Wings. I'm sure you're happy he was wrong as well. And I look forward to hearing what he has next. Check out the movie if you're a fan of Sir Paul. It's called Man on the Run, and it's currently streaming on Amazon. I think you'll I think you'll enjoy it. Till next time, we'll catch you again.